Hello, it's Randi Rhodes. Here's a clip from our show, and go to randyrhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.
Mary had a little man.
The fault. We believe that all men are created equal.
To the magnificent mosaic that is America.
From radio beacon to radio beacon. I have a dream today. Change has come to America.
Believe me.
Knock, knock. Who's there?
It's a figment of your imagination.
Randi Rhodes Show.
Turn up your mind.
Please describe to me what a public apology for 400 years of free labor in the South, especially Mississippi, will look like in the African American community in the new election.
All right. Thank you, Georgia.
In the new administration.
Thank you. So, America was founded on principles of liberty and freedom and on the backs of slave labor. This is a stain on America. And we're not going to fix that. We're not going to change that until we address it head on directly. And make no mistake, it's not just the original founding. It's what's happened generation after generation. The impact of discrimination handed down from one to the next means that today in America, because of housing discrimination, because of employment discrimination, we live in a world where for the average white family has $100, the average black family has about $5. So I believe it's time to start the national, full-blown conversation about reparations in this country.
All right. Now, people don't understand what that means. And I guess throughout this campaign, because Kamala Harris has brought it up, because Julian Castro has brought it up, because Elizabeth Warren has brought it up. I believe Mayor Pete Buttigieg is also interested in this conversation about reparations, that you will start to understand all the damage that's been done throughout the entire history of the United States up till and including yesterday. What? Yes, yesterday. I asked you to look up Curtis Flowers. Curtis Flowers is also a resident of Mississippi. Of course, now he lives in the penitentiary. But here's the case, okay? This is the story of Curtis Flowers' ridiculous, endless persecution, all right? Here's the case. This happened on the morning of July 16th, 1996. Do the math, everybody. 1996, 2006, 2016, 23 years. 23 years ago. This man, Curtis Flowers, is accused of a quadruple murder. On the morning of July 16th, a retired person, somebody who used to work at this place called Tardy Furniture, came into the store. A retired employee came into the store and, oh my God, he finds 4 bodies. He finds 4 bodies. He finds the owner of Tardy, and he finds 3 workers at the store, all of them shot to death. The suspect becomes then a man who worked at that store for 3 days, not the retired employee who just happens to, have a key and walk in? I don't know. But it becomes this guy, Curtis Flowers, who had worked at the store for all of 3 days and then quit or was fired. And that was 13 days before this retired employee goes into the store and finds everybody dead. Apparently, Mr. Flowers also owned Bertha Tardy, the owner of the store, $30. He owed her $30 for a cash advance on his paycheck, and he didn't complete the entire week, right? Certain eyewitnesses say they saw Curtis Flowers near the front of the store on the morning of the shootings. The police never found a gun, but they did pick up the bullets, and the bullets were the same caliber as a gun that had been stolen from a car. There is no direct evidence, just in case you're wondering, that I'm going to get to that ties Curtis Flowers to the gun. There is no direct evidence that ties the gun that they say was the gun used to the crime, because they never found the gun. Nevertheless, they charged Curtis Flowers with the murder in the shooting death of these 4 people. Well, there's a trial the next year, 1997. All right, 1997, the prosecutor decided that he was going to try Flowers just for the one death, for the death of the owner, sort of saving the other 3 murders in case he doesn't succeed, because there's no direct evidence at all connecting Curtis Flowers to this crime. So the evidence that was submitted by the prosecution, who decided to ask for the death penalty, said that bloody footprints found at the crime scene were a size 10.5, and Flowers wears a 10.5. They were able to do the forensics and figure out that they were Fila, Grant Hill style Filas. And the witnesses said that's what he was wearing that morning. They saw him that morning. He was wearing Fila Grant Hills. So then they introduced the projectiles, the bullet casings, and they find that they're 38 calibers, and they match a gun stolen from a car that happened to be owned by Mr. Flowers' uncle. The gun was stolen from Mr. Flowers' uncle's car the morning of the murder. $287 was found to be missing from the cash register at the store. And when they ransacked Mr. Flowers' girlfriend's house, she had $255. According to 2 of Flowers' cellmates, snitches, who were trying to get deals for themselves, they told the police that he admitted to them that he had stolen the money and committed the murders. Mr. Flowers denied all of that. And later, those 2 jailhouse snitches retracted their testimony. In the end, the witnesses who also said that he was wearing these Fila Grant Hills also retracted their testimony. Witnesses who described what Mr. Flowers was wearing that day had the wrong description of what he was wearing that day, and they retracted their testimony. And Flowers has consistently, throughout all these years, denied the murders. He said he never committed any crimes. He said he never told cellmates he committed any crimes. He said he was wearing Nikes. The clothes that he was wearing that day didn't match the description given by the witness. And he said that the only reason why there was any gunpowder on his thumb is because it was right after July 4th. It was July 16th. And he had been lighting fireworks the day before. And that was the day before the murders. He was convicted of the murder of the store owner, and he was sentenced to death in Montgomery County in 1997. That conviction was overturned by the Mississippi Supreme Court. The Mississippi Supreme Court, when you're a black man and your future's in the hands of the Mississippi Supreme Court, my God. But they found that the evidence that was presented by the state was prejudicial because it was beyond the necessary to prove the murder of the store owner alone, and that the prosecutor asked questions not in good faith and without any basis in fact. And they overturned the verdict, and they said, try him again. They remanded him for a retrial. In their opinion, the court wrote this: what may be a harmless error in a case with less at stake becomes irreversible error when the penalty is death. So the only thing that really saved him in this first fraudulent conviction rife with prosecutorial misconduct was the fact that the ultimate penalty, the death penalty, was what the jury voted for. He said the prosecutor repeatedly mentioned other killings and provided no evidence for them, and this was prosecutorial misconduct. All right. So the prosecutor decides he's going to do it again. So the second trial, the prosecutor asks for a change of venue. He doesn't like Montgomery County, okay? He says that he can't, he doesn't say this, but that Montgomery County is 50% African American. And he's scared that he's going to get a lot of African Americans showing up, for jury duty, right? So he moves it to another county. He moves it to Harrison County because he says, this guy can't get a fair jury in Montgomery County. That's all he said, not a fair jury. They try him again, and Flowers is convicted and sentenced to death. The Mississippi Supreme Court is petitioned again, and they say the same thing, that the prosecutor was guilty of prosecutorial misconduct and that he allowed evidence regarding crimes not on trial to be admitted, and other errors were made, and that they're overturning the verdict for prosecutorial misconduct. A third trial is held. Now we're into the 2000s, okay? This is 2004. A third trial is held in February of 2004. The prosecutor decides, I'm just going to try all 4 murders this time. The jury sentences him to death. The Mississippi Supreme Court overturns this verdict. And they say that the prosecutor was preempting jurors, black jurors. The prosecutor was racially motivated when he was selecting the jury. And the prosecutor was striking all the black jury people who came to jury duty, all the black people that showed up for jury duty, because Montgomery County is 45% African American. So when you get a summons for jury duty, you show up, and a lot of black people were showing up because that's the population. That's a jury of his peers. Well, this prosecutor kept striking every black juror. And the Supreme Court in Mississippi held that that's what he was doing. It said the state's preemptory challenges in jury selection were racially motivated and thus unconstitutional. They said during the selection process, the state challenged African American jurors with its first 7 strikes, which resulted in something called a Batson challenge. Batson is a Supreme Court decision that says that you can't strike potential jurors simply based on race, and now, of course, it includes gender too. But back then, okay? And they said that 7 times he, struck people just based on their race. So the prosecutor submits his grounds for its challenges, and he said, it had nothing to do with race. But the Supreme Court in Mississippi said, but then not only did you use your preemptory challenges to strike every African American, but then you used all of its remaining 5 challenges to strike nothing but African Americans. And then you used your 3 alternate juror strikes, because, you get alternates in case somebody can't, somebody dies or somebody's sick, right? And he struck African Americans, from that too. One African American juror recused himself because he didn't think he could be impartial. The Supreme Court stated that there was disparate treatment by the prosecutor in evaluation of black jurors compared with white jurors on issues such as jurors' connections with the defendants, jurors' willingness to use the death penalty. He struck blacks from the jury on grounds for which he did not strike whites. In addition, the court held that in many cases, the state presented race-neutral reasons to strike. It used the challenge process as, quote, an exercise in finding race-neutral reasons to justify the racially motivated strikes against African Americans. So they strike this one too. So now, same prosecutor says, I'm going to try him again. Same prosecutor tries him in the 4th trial in 2007. This time, the prosecution doesn't seek the death penalty, realizing that the Supreme Court, if they're going to impose the death penalty, keeps saying it's got to be a really clean trial. Because the only thing that was saving Mr. Flowers from this prosecutorial misconduct, from this racially motivated, selection of a jury for him, was that the ultimate penalty, the death penalty, was what this white jury kept coming up with. These white juries kept coming up with. So this time the prosecutor tries them the fourth time, doesn't seek the death penalty. This one ends in a mistrial. The jury was split 7-5. There were 5 African Americans on this jury, and the 5 who did not convict him or would not vote to convict were black. All the black jurors voted to acquit. That's a mistrial, okay? The 5th trial, also a mistrial. That was a jury of 9 white and 3 black jurors, and that ended in 2008 in a mistrial. There was one black man. He was the sole juror opposed to conviction. The trial judge accused that black juror of perjury. He said he was trying to taint the jury pool by suggesting that evidence had been planted against Mr. Flowers. The prosecution dropped the charges against this one black juror because he had no evidence to prove any of this. So an alternate, a second juror, also voted to acquit. And that juror was charged with perjury for lying during jury selection because the prosecutor said she didn't know Mr. Flowers, and she did. So on to trial number 6. This one, they moved to a place called Winona, Mississippi on June 10th, 2010. 11 white jurors and 1 black juror. Now, they're back in Montgomery County, where this prosecutor argued way back in the day this man could not get a fair trial because why? He said, the jury pool is tainted. They know this case, blah, blah, blah. So now it's trial number 6, and he moves it back to Montgomery County, where 50% of the people who live there are African American. Meanwhile, he picks a jury of 11 white jurors, 1 black juror, in this county that's half black. They get a conviction. In June of 2016, his lawyer finally says, I'm going to appeal this to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court said it would hear this case and that they would review it for racial bias in jury selection. The Mississippi Supreme Court in November 2017 affirmed finally the 6th trial and his conviction. So that's how it. So then his lawyer said, "You know what? I'm going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court." So in June of 2018, his lawyer wrote what's called a writ of certiorari, which is asking the Supreme Court to hear this case based on racial bias. And the Supreme Court said that they would hear it. Yesterday was oral arguments in this case. Clarence Thomas decided that this was the one time he was going to ask a question, because this guy remained silent during oral arguments all the time. The last time Clarence Thomas asked a question was 3 years ago. He never asked anything. 3 years ago. He says he thinks the oral arguments are too oral. There's too much talking in the oral arguments. So that's why he says he doesn't ask any questions. I'm going to play you the news report of what he asked.
Randi Rhodes Show is live on RandiRhodes.com and the free Progressive Voices app for Android and iOS. Visit the App Store or ProgressiveVoices.com now.
Curtis Flowers, as you said, he was tried 6 times for murder. He wants the Supreme Court to overturn his conviction because he says the prosecutor, the same prosecutor who tried all those cases, was illegally striking prospective jurors based on race. And Brooke, the numbers were pretty alarming. At one point in the first 2 trials, all 10 prospective black jurors were struck, and there were many more questions asked of the black jurors. So in the Supreme Court, it did seem like a majority of the justices, they were ready to rule in favor of Flowers. But Thomas, when he spoke up and he asked these questions, he had a question for Flowers' attorney, and he wanted to know if any white jurors were struck. So that sure does give you a hint of where he may be going in this case. And just a few years ago, Brooke, the entire court in a very similar case ruled in favor of a Georgia inmate, Clarence Thomas. He dissented in that case, and he said he didn't think that the Supreme Court should question the judgment in these kind of issues of the trial court. So it was an interesting moment today, Brooke, in a very compelling case.
That is sick. That is a self-loathing black man, okay? There is no question that that is a sick and strange question. The Supreme Court yesterday, in these oral arguments concerning Curtis Flowers, 6 trials, and of course, 2 of his trials, the only ones that had more than one African-American in the jury pool, resulted in hung juries, okay? The prosecutor is the same prosecutor. He's been prosecuting this man for 23 years, over and over and over, even when the Mississippi Supreme Court said he engages in prosecutorial misconduct. He strikes black jurors consistently. He asks more questions of black jurors than he does of white jurors. And I got to tell you, even Justice Alito, this is the Supreme Court for you. They want to know, in this case, whether or not they should consider the prosecutorial misconduct of the prosecutor in the other 5 trials or just this 6th one. That was a real question. That's what Alito asked. Alito wanted to know, do I look at all these 5 trials and all the times that he was jury tampering? Do I look at all the times that he struck black jurors from the beginning? Or do we just look at this one? Are you freaking kidding me? So they answered him. They go, no, I think you look at this one prosecutor who's been prosecuting this man for 23 years. I think you look at all his behavior over all the trials. So Alito said, okay, the history of the case prior to this trial is very troubling. You think? And John Roberts, he doesn't know how far he should go in, overturning the will of a jury. The lawyer that's representing Mr. Flowers is Sherry Lynn Johnson, and she said the court has made it very clear in past rulings that the history of this prosecutor is relevant. There is no way to look at this record of 6 trials, and the only 2 trials out of 6 that had more than one black juror on it ended in mistrials. There is no way to consider the fate of this man without looking at this single prosecutor and the record of this single prosecutor and the motivations of this single prosecutor. She said to the court, the only plausible interpretation of all this evidence viewed cumulatively is that prosecutor Doug Evans began jury selection in the 2010 trial with an unconstitutional end in mind, to seat as few African-American jurors as he could. And of course, in this last and 6th trial, there was only one African-American included on the jury in Montgomery County, where, as I previously told you, the population is 50% black. Judge Sonia Sotomayor called Evans' passion for prosecuting Flowers staggering. She said the difference in how prosecutor Evans questioned white potential jurors and black potential jurors was staggering. She said in the 2010 trial, he asked 145 questions of 5 black potential jurors he rejected, and only asked 12 questions to 11 white jurors. Quote, except for her race, you would think that this is a juror that the prosecutors would love when she walks in the door, speaking about an African-American potential jury member who said she supports the death penalty. But that African-American was struck from the jury as well. Even Brett Kavanaugh had trouble with this case. Okay? Brett Kavanaugh apparently has written like a whole college thesis on this Batson ruling from the court. It's a decision that was reached by the Supreme Court in 1986. It's not a law, it's a decision. And the Batson decision in 1986 says that challenges cannot be used to strike potential jurors because of their race. It's very simple. Later, gender was added to the criteria. So if you had a rape case, you couldn't, strike jurors because they were women or because they were men. In a more recent decision, the court said judges need to consider the totality of the circumstances when deciding whether a prosecutor was using challenges to jury members as a pretext for barring jurors because of their race. Well, Kavanaugh, Yale lost. You know Kavanaugh, right? Okay, he wrote an article when he was at Yale that called for very, very tough enforcement of the Batson rule, of the Batson decision in 1986. He said that he didn't think that this prosecutor, Mr. Evans, lived up to the intent of that decision. This is what Kavanaugh said, quote, part of Batson was about confidence of the community and the fairness of the criminal justice system, right? And that was against a backdrop of a lot of decades of all white juries convicting black defendants. So Kavanaugh was in a mood yesterday to overturn Mr. Flowers' conviction. And then Clarence Thomas asks, well, did they strike white potential jurors too? And the attorney for Mr. Flowers said they had struck white jurors because there were no black jurors left. He had gone through all the black potential jury members, and he had used preemptory strikes and challenges, and it's like a bingo game. I don't know if you ever saw a jury being selected. I have. It's a very strange process. It's really like a bingo game. But she said, well, of course he struck white jurors because there were no black people left to strike. He had stricken all of them. They were all gone. And then she pointed out, it is prosecutors Evans' conduct that we are looking at today, okay? But Clarence Thomas, 3 years ago, was the lone dissenter in a case just like this one. The lone dissenter in a case just like this one. He said that in the last case where they were looking at prosecutorial misconduct and racial bias in jury selection, he was the lone dissenter. He said courts in most cases should defer to the decisions made by the trial judge. And he indicated that he probably feels the same way in this case. That, my friends, is institutional racism. And the reason why it can't just be a check when we talk about repairing or recompense or reparations, whatever you want to call it, is because people who have been wrongly convicted, they get out of jail because DNA evidence, like the Central Park Five, for instance. And then they sue and they win money damages. But that is not a replacement for 23 years of a man's life on death row, is it? No. What you want is the full package of reparations. So this cannot happen again, even or especially in Mississippi. That is why it's not just a check. Go to RandiRhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.